Have you ever wished for something so badly you felt like you couldn't live without it? Well, what if getting that one thing was the very thing that destroyed you? Today, we're jumping into this incredible story where a simple craving for a better meal turns into a terrifying lesson about being careful what you wish for. This is the story of the day the food literally fell from the sky. So, that's the big question, isn't it? What really happens when you get exactly what you wish for? Let's dive in and see how this one plays out. All right, so our story kicks off not with some quiet, polite request. Oh no, it starts with a roar of divine fire, a massive warning shot that, you'll see, goes tragically ignored. Okay, let's break this down verse by verse. So, verse 1, it all starts with the people complaining. They're just grumbling about their hardships. And bam, God's anger flares up and this fire just erupts on the edges of the camp, devouring everything in its path. Then, in verse 2, you have total panic. The people are screaming, crying out to Moses. He steps up, says a prayer, and whoosh, the fire just dies out. All that's left is smoke and this black charred ground. And that leads us to verse 3. To make sure nobody ever forgets this moment, Moses names the place Taberah, which literally means burning. It's like a permanent scar on the landscape, a reminder of what happens when they complain. You'd think a giant fire from the sky would get the message across, right? Nope, not even close. That fire couldn't burn away what they really wanted. In fact, this was just the warm-up. So, check this out. Verse 4, this intense craving for meat starts with a group the Bible calls the mixed multitude. Basically, the non-Israelites who tagged along. And this craving, it spreads like a virus. Soon, the entire nation is literally weeping, crying for meat. Now, in verse 5, we see it's not just about hunger, it's nostalgia. They're daydreaming about all the food they had back in Egypt. You know, the free fish, the crunchy cucumbers and juicy melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. And that brings us to verse 6. They look at what they have now and say, we've got nothing but this manna. Our strength is gone. It's like that colorful dream of Egypt just pops, and all they're left with is the bland, boring desert. So, you might be wondering, what exactly was this manna they hated so much? Well, verse 7 tells us. It was small, kind of like a coriander seed, and it had this whitish, resin-like look. Just imagine waking up every morning to find the ground covered in these tiny, pearly seeds. Then in verses 8 and 9, we learn what they did with it. They'd gather it up, grind it down, and bake it into these little cakes that tasted, well, like pastries made with oil. I mean, it was a miracle, a constant supply of food. But for them, it just became this boring, joyless chore, day in and day out. Now, this is where the story takes a really interesting turn. Because all this constant whining, it's not just getting on God's nerves, it's absolutely crushing their leader, Moses. Okay, so verse 10. Picture this. Moses can hear every single family wailing at the door of their tent. It's this overwhelming sound of misery. And God is getting angry again, but this time, Moses is just broken. In verse 11, he just unloads on God. He's like, why? Why have you done this to me? Why did you dump the burden of all these people on my shoulders? You can just feel the weight in his voice. And then in verse 12, it just boils over. It's so raw. He says, did I conceive them? Did I give birth to them? Am I their mother that you expect me to carry them around like a baby? And just to give you a sense of scale here, we're talking about 600,000 men on foot. 600,000. And that's not even counting all the women and children. The sheer size of his responsibility, it's just staggering. And he's not done. In verse 13, his rant keeps going. He screams out, where am I supposed to get meat for all of them? You can almost see him, right? Standing in the middle of this vast, empty desert with this huge crowd behind him, just chanting for meat. And then, verse 14, he finally just admits it, and you can practically hear his voice breaking. I can't do this alone. The burden is too heavy for me. He is completely, totally at his breaking point. This leads to verse 15, which is just, wow. This is the absolute bottom for him. He begs God, if this is how you're going to treat me, just kill me. Right here, right now. Don't let me watch myself fail like this. I mean, think about that. This is a leader in such complete despair that he'd rather die than keep going. But God's response is really fascinating. He doesn't get mad at Moses for this outburst. Instead, he comes up with a two-part solution. Part 1 is to fix Moses' leadership problem. And part 2 is to fix the people's craving. So the first part of this divine plan, it all centers on one number, 70. In verses 16 and 17, God gives Moses these clear instructions. He says, "Go gather 70 of Israel's elders." Then he says he's going to take some of the spirit that's on Moses and put it on them. That way, they can share the load. The burden will finally be spread out. Okay, now for the people. In verse 18, God tells Moses, "Go tell them to get ready. Tomorrow, they're getting their meat." You can just imagine the sound, right? The weeping just stops on a dime, replaced by these looks of total shock and excitement. But then, in verses 19 and 20, comes the twist. God says, "Oh, you won't be eating it for a day, or 5 days, or even 20. You're going to eat it for a whole month. You're going to eat it until it's literally coming out of your noses, and you are sick to death of it." And why? Because they had rejected the God who was right there with them the whole time. Now, in verses 21 and 22, Moses is still thinking like a human, right? He's doing the math in his head, and it's not adding up. He asks God, how? Are we supposed to slaughter all our animals? Are we going to catch every fish in the sea to feed this many people? And God's response in verse 23 is just this epic, conversation-ending question. He just asks, is the Lord's arm too short? And what can you even say to that? It completely silences any doubt. So Moses does exactly what he's told. In verses 24 and 25, he gathers those 70 elders. And then the Lord descends in a cloud, takes some of that spirit from Moses, and places it on the elders. And in that instant, they all begin to prophesy. Can you just see it? This glowing presence touches each man, and their eyes go wide as they start speaking with this powerful, unified, divine authority. But here's a cool little side story. In verses 26 and 27, it turns out 2 of the elders, guys named Eldad and Medad, didn't make it to the meeting. They stayed back in the camp. But it doesn't matter. The Spirit finds them anyway, and they start prophesying right there in the middle of everything. And this huge, confused crowd gathers around them. So then, in verses 28 and 29, Joshua, Moses' right-hand man, he runs up to Moses and says, "My Lord, you have to make them stop." But Moses' response is just incredible. He says, "Are you jealous for me? I wish every single one of the Lord's people were prophets." And with that, in verse 30, Moses and the elders head back to camp. The leadership problem is officially solved. All right, so part 1 of the plan is done. The leadership is sorted. Now for part 2. The people are about to get exactly what they cried for, special delivery straight from the sky. So verse 31, a wind starts blowing from the sea. But this isn't a rainstorm. It's carrying quail, millions of them. So many that they just fall out of the sky and cover the ground like 3 feet deep for miles in every direction. I mean, don't picture birds gently landing. Picture the sky turning black with them, and then they just drop. It's a literal sea of birds on the ground. And in verse 32, the people go nuts. For 2 days and a whole night, they just gather quail in a frenzy. The text says that the person who gathered the least still had a ridiculous amount. It's a picture of just pure, uncontrolled greed. And then verse 33, the final brutal punchline to this whole story. While the meat is still in their mouths, they haven't even swallowed their first bite, God strikes them with a terrible plague. Which brings us to verse 34. They name the place Kibroth Hattahava, which means graves of craving. Because that's what it was, a mass grave for the people who were consumed by their own desires. And then verse 35. The people just move on. The tragedy is done and the journey continues. And that brings us right back to where we started. It leaves us with this one big question. Is getting what you want always a blessing? This story is just such a powerful warning, isn't it? It's about the dangers of letting your desires run wild, the importance of being grateful for what you have, and the incredible weight of leadership. And maybe, just maybe, it teaches us that sometimes the real blessing is in not getting what we think we want.